The third thing I want you to see about becoming spiritually strong is this, is that you need to live in the promise. Where is God blessing? What is God doing? We want to live in the promises of God. Here's what it says, verse 3, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. Just as I promised to Moses. I just want to say something. God has already given it to him, but Joshua has to cash the check. Think about it like this. If I were to hand you a check for $1,000, the money's in the bank, but that check is no good if as long as it's in your hands. You have to do something with that check. What I'm trying to show you is this, is that sometimes people say, well, if it's God's will, it's going to happen. Not true. It requires us taking our steps as well. Because God desires that none shall perish, but that all shall have everlasting life, but that's not how it always is. God has given you a promise, and now you have to live in that promise and work and walk out the promises of God in your life. Listen to what it says here. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness in this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, towards going down to the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. That's a promise. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I have sworn to their fathers to give them. Now, if you remember back to week 1 of our study through Joshua, if you weren't here, you can listen on YouTube. If not, just recall all the Sunday school stories from whenever you were a child. This is not Joshua's first time to see the promised land. In fact, Joshua saw the promised land 40 years earlier in the book of Numbers. Moses sent 12 spies to go and do reconnaissance about the promised land to see what they were up against. 10 spies came back and they gave a negative report. 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, came back and they gave a positive report. They said, this land is flowing with milk and honey and there's grapes the size of your head. Okay, how many of you know when God gives you a promise, it's a good promise? Right, that milk and honey, right? That ain't just corner store milk, right? I mean, that's Whole Foods milk. That's what God promises you. He's not promising you skim milk, 2% milk, or even that almond milk. I mean, this is like $8 a carton worth of milk. God gives some good milk. And the honey, man, that's the honey that comes straight from the farmer's market. I mean, this is organic, non-GMO, just, the good stuff. And that's what God promises. God has good for us. And then as they come back and they say, here's what we saw. We see that 10 people, they focused on the problems. They would say there's giants in the land and we look like grasshoppers compared to them. They're going to crush us. They're going to kill us. They're going to destroy us. God brought us here to fail. We might as well just go back to Egypt because that's what our future is. And 10 people, they focused on the negative and the problems, but you have Joshua and Caleb. They come in and they say, we are more than conquerors. God has promised to give us this land. We can do it. We can take it. And so they have a positive report. But because of the unbelief of the others, Israel had to wander around the wilderness for 40 years until that entire generation passed away. What's the lesson for us? Is that every single one of us, we have a choice. That you can either focus on the problems or you can focus on the promise of God. Every single one of us, in our day-to-day lives, we have a decision that we must make. We can either focus on the problems that are around us or we can focus on the promise that God has given to us. I mean, if you have ever met a person where all they do is focus on the problems, they bring you problems, they don't bring you solutions, all they do is ever talk about the problems. My life is so terrible, my life is so horrible, nothing ever seems to go my way, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I might as well just go eat worms. Right? You ever met that person? You ever met that person where they're like, yesterday was terrible, today is terrible, tomorrow's gonna be terrible, and I got a rash. You ever met that person? Where like just nothing ever goes good in their life. Do you know why? Because that's the mindset that they have. Because they live their entire life focusing on the problems, and what you see is what you get. And so if all you do is focus on the problems, guess what you're gonna find? You're gonna find problems. But if you focus on the promise of God and the words that he has spoken over you, if you focus on the truth, if you focus on the promise, then you're gonna be walking around living in the promises of God. This is what he says here. Everywhere you put your foot, I have given you. What is that? That's a promise. And so Joshua, he decides, well, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna live in the promise of God. I'm just gonna put the promise of God to test in my life. And then Joshua says, if this land's mine, I'm gonna take this land. I'm gonna go over here, I'm gonna take this land, and I'm gonna fight this battle. I'm gonna take this territory. I'm gonna have this victory. I'm gonna go over here, and that land looks pretty good over there, so I'm gonna go. And for 24 chapters, here's what Joshua's doing. He's living in the promise of God. Let me just go ahead and show you a map of what we're gonna see over the book of Joshua. This is his conquest throughout this entire book. And you can just see, it starts right there at the River Jordan, it parts. He goes to Gilgal and to Gibeon. He goes down to Jarmuth and then to Azekah and then to Libnah and Lachish and Makkedah. Just say it fast and people think you know what you're talking about. Eglon, I can't say any of these words, and Hebron. And he spends 24 chapters just bouncing around all of the promised land. And just to give you an idea, the promised land is 300,000 square foot. For comparison, Texas is 250,000 square foot. And you know how they say everything's bigger in Texas, but I'll tell you, God's promises are bigger than anything that we face. Because God's promises are bigger than the problems that we face. Now, I'm not saying that we be naive, because there is gonna be battles, there is gonna be dark days, there is gonna be difficulties, there is gonna be war that we must go up against. I mean, Joshua's gonna have to fight a 7-nation army 10 times their size. He's not just putting his head in the sand, pretending like nothing's gonna ever go wrong. No, he is aware of the problems, but he is focusing on the promise of God in his life. And I love the parallels that we're seeing in our church right now as we study through the book of Joshua as well. I love it because at our church, we're even encountering some problems, but yet we're choosing to live in the promise of God. It's about this time last year, God spoke to my heart. He said, Byron, it's time for you to tell the church to start raising money and buy a new building. It's time for you guys to move. I don't know if you know this, but in March, our lease is up and we will be homeless as a church if we don't make a move. And so I just started praying and I said, God, are you sure that it's time for us to buy this new building? Because I don't know if you noticed or not, but we're kind of in the middle of a pandemic. People are in the hospital, losing their jobs. There's economic uncertainty. Oh, and we just got hit by 3 hurricanes. Okay, you really think now is the good time for me to stand in front of the church and say, hey guys, guess what? We're buying a building. I need everybody to give. And so I'm arguing with God. It's like, God, this is not right. This is not the time. I don't see it. I was focusing on the problems. And when I get really worked up and stressed out, you know what I do? I go for a run. And so as I'm running, I'm kind of arguing and thinking and complaining to God, focusing on the problems. And so I was really worked up, so I decided to go for the longest run that I've ever done. Up until that point, I was going to run 15 miles that day. And so what I did is, it's a 7-mile run to the hike and bike, do a loop around the hike and bike, 7-mile run back home. And I planned my runs according to like water along the routes. And there's a water fountain at the hike and bike. So I'm like, I'm gonna run the 7 miles there, drink some water, and then I'm gonna run back. As I get to the hike and bike, due to COVID, the water fountain is closed. So I have to run the entire second leg of the run back home, no water. At this point, it doesn't matter how mentally strong you are. If you're physically dehydrated, you're done. And so I am dehydrated, exhausted, completely depleted. And about 10 miles in, I just sit down on the side of Delaware. And I was like, God, you have brought me here to die. And then I look down next to me and there is an unopened Ozarka water bottle right next to me. And I open that bad boy up and I just chug that whole thing. And I drink it, and as soon as I set it back down, I hear the Lord speak to me clear as day. He says, if I can give you a water bottle, I can give you a building. Trust me. And from that day forward, I'm not naive to the problems, but I do have my mind set on the promise that God said, I will give you this land. I will make a way for you. And every time a problem comes up, I just keep speaking that promise of God over my life. Every time something goes wrong, I just say, that must mean something's got better for us. And so we're just gonna live in that promise. And yeah, there has been problems. It took us 6 months to find a building. And then we just ended up buying this entire city block because that's the promise of God on our church. Whatever the bank said, it's gonna be 0% down. I was like, hallelujah, praise the Lord. And they called back and said, oh, never mind. It's gonna be 60,000 down and you got 3 weeks to come up with the money. And I'm like, okay, Lord, let's do this. And in 2 weeks, God gave us $108,000 from outside sources and within the church. Yes, there have been problems, but I choose to focus on the promise of God for my life. What are you focusing on? That's what you'll find. You want to live in God's promises.